Welcome to the Arms Control Primer, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control, based in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments on the most critical issues. Whether you are new to the topic or need a refresher, please join us in our exploration of the nuclear past, present, and future. In this season, we examine the histories and policies of countries that may have had nuclear weapons ambitions or even nuclear arsenals and gave them up. We search for lessons for non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I hope it helps you better know a non-nuke.
By the early 1980s, the development of nuclear warheads really gained momentum. This was all accompanied by international criticism and sanctions, and you can only look to the US administrations during that time. Except for the Carter administration, Nixon and Reagan, they were turning a blind eye on the South African ambiguity in the nuclear field.
South Africa never felt that they would need more than about the 6 devices that they did develop at that point. It was not high-impact devices. It was maybe about 15 to 20 kilotons, about the same size as the Hiroshima bomb. And the plan was always to just use it as a demonstration, as deterrent against conventional assault forces.
Today, we tackle the unique story of South Africa, the only country to build its own nuclear arsenal and voluntarily relinquish it. In the 1980s, South Africa built 6 gun-type nuclear weapons and developed an unusual doctrine to fit such a small arsenal. In 1991, South Africa dismantled the program and soon joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. Professor Anna-Mart and Dr. Möser tell us about the history of the program and the complexities of verifying its disarmament. The conversation covers one of the biggest unresolved mysteries of the nuclear age and takes us to a time in which the United States and the Soviet Union collaborated to stop the spread of nuclear weapons.
I'm Anna-Mart. I'm a professor of international relations at the University of Johannesburg and a nuclear historian. The South African nuclear development took place in 5 phases. The first phase was the early years of uranium trade and technology, which took place from the 1940s to the 1960s. And the focus here was very much on exporting uranium, which was a byproduct of the gold mines around Johannesburg. So the export of raw uranium to the Allied powers towards the end of the Second World War to be used in the various nuclear weapons development programs of the US and the UK at that point. In 1948, the Atomic Energy Act was passed in South Africa, which focused on the civilian development of nuclear energy. Fast forward into the 1950s, South Africa signed an Atoms for Peace agreement with the United States. By the end of the 1950s, they started building South Africa's first nuclear installation close to Pretoria at a place which is called Pelindaba. Pelindaba is basically a combination of 2 of the native languages in South Africa, which basically means we are done talking about this, we are going forward with the nuclear development. That installation was then built in the early 1960s. A reactor that South Africa acquired from the United States under the Atoms for Peace program was then installed at Pelindaba. It was a highly enriched uranium reactor, but it was a research reactor. South Africa also got quantities of highly enriched uranium, small quantities of that, for further testing and development in this research reactor. By the mid-1960s, South Africa was fast on its way to developing its own unique uranium enrichment process. Because South Africa was rich in uranium, and at that point, interested to develop a peaceful nuclear explosive device. But by 1970, the Prime Minister at the time, John Vorster, then made the announcement that South Africa had developed its own unique uranium enrichment process. At that point, they were looking for overseas partners to share this unique process for commercial benefit. With chatting to France at that point, West Germany was also interested in the South African process as well as Italy. But in the end, they decided not to share the technology and to just develop it in South Africa. Another facility was then built next to Pelindaba, which was called Valendaba, where the enrichment then took place. And Valendaba basically means we don't talk about this at all, because it was a very secretive process. They wanted to keep it secret. At that point, South Africa was also starting to become quite isolated in the world. The second phase was political drivers and international isolation, which took place from the 1960s to the 1970s. Already by the end of the 60s, early 70s, there were quite a lot of rumors about South Africa already being busy with the nuclear weapons program. That created quite a lot of tension amongst African states. It's also important to note at this point that the South African liberation movements, the African National Congress and some others, had been declared illegal in the early 1960s, and most of its leaders were imprisoned. So you also had the isolation of South Africa, that the ANC launched an armed struggle against South Africa. You would also see that going into the 1970s, there was this emerging threat perception amongst the apartheid government, which would ultimately lead to their decision to develop nuclear weapons. In the middle of the 1960s, there were already quite a few rumors going about that South Africa was probably engaged in already making a nuclear weapons program. There were a few statements by people in the mid-1960s. They alluded to the fact that South Africa was thinking about a nuclear explosive power, mimicking the United States Plowshare program. Very interesting, in Los Angeles Times in July 1967, it was written, France had agreed to buy up to 50% of South Africa's uranium output. In return, South Africa asked for 25 5-kiloton atomic bombs. Where they got this quote from, it is unknown. Everybody has denied ever since that this was the case. But it was considered a certainty in diplomatic sources that France agreed to provide technical assistance to South African scientists who were now experimenting with PNE research at the end of the 60s. South Africa in the 60s also became a leader and is still one of the biggest exporters of medical radioisotopes in the world. As a result of that civil technical development in the 60s, South Africa is still at the forefront of the civil uses of nuclear power. They also wanted to build their own unique natural uranium reactor in the 1960s, but opted to instead go with the uranium enrichment process. But the question is, if you want to go with the uranium enrichment process and you are enriching beyond 20%, as is the case now with Iran that has enriched until 60%, why would you want to go beyond 20% if you do not have these visions of creating a nuclear explosives device, which is exactly what South Africa did from 1970. The third phase was the emergence of a perceived regional and internal communist threat, which led to the decision to go nuclear in 1978. South Africa at that point had two neighbors who were under colonial governance of Portugal, being Mozambique and Angola. Angola does not neighbor South Africa directly, but South Africa was in Southwest Africa, which was given as a mandate to South Africa after the First World War. Some liberation movements started with incursions into Southwest Africa from Angola. And that is where this whole thing about the border war comes from. So in both Angola and in Mozambique, communist governments were installed after withdrawal of Portugal from those two countries. And the apartheid government was, typical in Cold War fashion, was terrified about the possible incursion of communism into South Africa. That's why they call it the communist threat that would ultimately lead, by the end of the 1970s, to the decision to make a nuclear bomb. But there was also the internal communist threat, the South African Communist Party as well as the ANC, which was now in exile. So we see that South Africa then became involved in the civil war in Angola in the mid-1970s. And that border war basically would go on until the end of the 1980s. Now, what then led to the decision in 1978? In 1977, there was a mandatory arms embargo that was implemented against South Africa. South Africa became quite isolated in terms of this war that it was fighting. All the doors have closed in terms of getting conventional military equipment that they needed for this ongoing border war with Angola. At the same time, they had developed at this point a PNE, a peaceful nuclear explosive, which was to be tested in late 1977 in the Kalahari Desert. It would have been a non-nuclear test, but they wanted to test the mechanism of this device. Evening before it happened, the Soviet Union found out about it, possibly through a highly placed spy that they had in the South African Navy. They then warned South Africa not to continue. The Soviet Union also tipped off the United States, who also, from their side, warned South Africa not to continue with any nuclear tests that they were contemplating at that point. But by 1978, due to the arms embargo, South Africa was basically excluded from many of the United Nations body at that point. That is when they decided to go nuclear, to develop nuclear weapons as a deterrent, or what they call a bargaining chip. It was much more a political decision than it was a defense decision. But the Prime Minister at that point, being P.W. Botha, felt that the threat against South Africa had become such a threat that it was necessary that South Africa got a deterrent. The decision was then taken in 1978 to develop a limited number of nuclear weapons. They had a 3-phase strategy. It was never meant to be an offensive weapon. The strategy was, if the threat against South Africa became an existential threat, they would first reach out to the United States and say, look, please come and help us. If the United States then say, no, we're not going to help you, they would go to the second step, which would be, okay, we have nuclear weapons, we admit it now. If you don't come and help us, we will explode one of our nuclear devices. And if that didn't work, they would go to phase 3, which would be physically exploding one of the nuclear devices, which would then petrify the big communist threat against South Africa at that point. Because the border war had escalated in 1985 to an escalating conventional war. So in 1986, the 3 phases of the nuclear strategy added a 4th phase to that. And for the first time, they talk about using a nuclear weapon on the battlefield. In their words, it was never meant to be used offensively, but they hoped that if they would go to the 4th phase, it would scare the troops in Angola so much that they would withdraw. You had these 2 conventional armies being head-to-head, but the South Africans were starting to become a little bit outgunned by the Soviet-backed Cubans in Angola. I alluded to the cold test that they wanted to do in the Kalahari Desert in 1977. After that, of course, they were now caught out, so they couldn't do any tests on South African soil at that point. Then in 1979, there was a satellite, which is specifically called the Vela satellite. It's a certain type of satellite made by the United States that picked up the signature double flash of a nuclear explosion. And this satellite then picked up such a flash in the South Indian Ocean, where the Indian and Atlantic Oceans roughly come together. There's an island that belongs to South Africa, the Prince Edward Island, and it's more than 1,000 miles south of Cape Town. The Vela satellite picked up this flash, and immediately there were questions about, okay, who was responsible? Prince Edward Island, being part of South Africa, immediately raised suspicions that South Africa did conduct a nuclear test. At the same time, there has been some suspicion that it could have been a joint test between South Africa and Israel. South Africa outright denied that they were responsible, and at that point followed the same policy of ambiguity that the Israelis also had about their nuclear weapons program. So both nations at that point refused to accept responsibility for that. Who was responsible still remains unclear. The CIA suspected that it was a small device, suggesting that it was a tactical nuclear device. But to this day, nobody has, in fact, accepted responsibility for that. The satellite photos are available widely on the internet these days. There's an entire section on the National Security Archive dedicated to this. But I've heard many rumors over the years. South Africa at that point only had the one cold test device. So it's unclear whether they had progressed to a more advanced type of smaller nuclear type device to be tested closer to Prince Edward Island. If it was a test, there was a cyclone over that area during the time when this happened in September 1979. I think the plan was to test this device under the cloud cover of the cyclone, but it started clearing faster than whoever was responsible expected that it was going to clear. And that is why the Vela satellite picked it up. So today, still, South Africa and Israel both deny that they were responsible. Was it a joint test? Was it a unilateral test? They were allies at that point, but it remains a mystery as to who were really responsible for the test. Then the 4th phase was what I call the Lager mentality, and going into nuclear weapons development, which was 1978 to 1989. The Lager mentality comes from the history of the white South African Afrikaners. So it's spelled L-A-A-G-E-R, which means it's a circle of wagons. Between 1836 and 1838, the Afrikaner people in South Africa, they decided to go into the interior of South Africa. Now, in the evenings, of course, because of all the wild animals in Africa, and then they would make a circle of that with all of the cattle and everybody on the inside of that wagon. It means a defensive encirclement. And we're doing this on our own. We're defending ourselves by assuming this defensive position. That's why I call it a lager mentality that led to the decision to go it alone and to acquire a nuclear deterrent. The 1980s, I think, is important in the sense that the program has accelerated at that point. In the beginning of the 1980s, there was a top secret new nuclear facility that opened up not too far from Pelindaba and Walendaba. But it was built underground, and it was built in such a way that satellites would not pick it up. And this is where advanced research then took place into the development of South Africa's small nuclear arsenal, with a nuclear deterrent as the basis. But then in 1980s, the program accelerated a little bit. But South Africa never felt that they would need more than about the 6 devices that they did develop at that point. It was not high-impact devices. It was maybe about 15 to 20 kilotons, about the same size as the Hiroshima bomb. And the plan was always to just use it as a demonstration. Even when the war escalated in Angola in the 1980s, and they added that fourth strategy to use on a battlefield as deterrent against conventional assault forces, they did add immediately that no strategic application was foreseen, merely a threat of use. At that point, they realized that there were spies in the South African establishment, especially after 1982, when the spy that tipped off the Soviet Union about the impending Kalahari test was arrested by the FBI and then extradited to South Africa. The apartheid government was suspecting that there were other spies high up in the political system, and they were hoping that the news would spread that South Africa have nuclear weapons and that it would have an impact on decision-making as to any attacks against South Africa. So in 1986, they reopened the underground testing facility in the Kalahari and refurbished that with the hope, again, that satellites would pick it up and that would further spread the rumor that South Africa is preparing for another nuclear test, and that they hoped that could also have an impact on any military action that was planned against South Africa at that point. And then the fifth phase was the end to the border war, which broke out in the 1970s on the border with Angola, between Southwest Africa and Angola, and then also the decommissioning of the weapons program and acceding to the NPT, which took place between 1989 and 1991. In 1989, there was the decision to dismantle and decommission the nuclear weapons program because the border war had now ended. In South Africa, the apartheid government had to look inwards now to the internal threat in South Africa. At that point, I will go as far as to say that there was a limited civil war going on in South Africa. So South Africa was really on a knife's edge in 1989. And then P.W. Botha, who was very much a militant prime minister, later became president, he suffered a stroke in February 1989. And that gave an opportunity for a more open-minded president to take over in South Africa, being F.W. de Klerk. So later in 1989, when he officially became the leader of the National Party and president, he then took a decision that the nuclear weapons program was not in South Africa's best interest. They were starting negotiations with the ANC at that point for a transition to democracy in South Africa. And that's basically then what led to phase 5, which was the end of the border war between 1988 and 1989, an eclipse of power in the South African political establishment, then the decision to decommission the weapons program, which was taken around about November, December 1989.
My name is Robin Möser. I'm a researcher in the Science for Nuclear Diplomacy group at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. PRIF is the acronym, but I'm also working at the Technical University Darmstadt. And I mainly deal with issues around nuclear verification and arms control, and have been working on South Africa's nuclear past and the non-proliferation regime during the Cold War. I published the book Disarming Apartheid, the End of South Africa's Nuclear Weapons Program and Accession to the NPT. At the imminent end of the Cold War in the region, there was a new momentum injected into the NPT negotiations. The NPT depository powers, the former Soviet Union, the UK and the US, they had been involved over years discussing South Africa's NPT entry with Pretoria's authorities, but only towards the end of the Cold War, when the security climate from South Africa's perspective eased a little, actually the talks reached a new level. The South Africans changed their position from wanting to resume nuclear technology sharing under Article 5 of the NPT towards making their own NPT entry in connection with the regional states. That was more for the domestic political realm, to show that we actually gained something in response for our own accession to the treaty. They wanted the foreign states of the region, Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, to sign the NPT before the South Africans did themselves. And for this to achieve, the South Africans asked the Soviet and UK and US officials to lobby on their behalf in the frontline states' capitals. And that is what they did. So between 1990 and 91, you have Soviet officials, for example, the former foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Edward Shevardnadze, traveling to Southern Africa and speaking to these African head of states and telling them, okay, if you join the NPT, the South Africans might soon join as well. And that is actually what happened. And you have 6 out of the states that hadn't signed the NPT join during 1990 and 92. And in July 91, the South Africans also signed the treaty. And 2 months later, signed with the IAEA a comprehensive safeguard agreement. So within 2 years or 3 years, we actually achieved a lot that hadn't been achieved for 2 decades prior to that final years of the Cold War.
Robin Möser continues the story about South Africa's nuclear disarmament by sharing the results of his historical investigation into the decision-making process to abandon the program.
To start with, I need to mention that all the nuclear security issues and strategic aspects were discussed and decided upon by a very small group. I think 10 to 12 people at the most. And this involved the head of the government, the finance minister, the mineral and energies minister, their secretary generals, and people from the SADF, the South African military forces. So this was a very tight-knit white male group. And they, for years, were opposed to NPT accession. And they wanted to continue with the nuclear weapons program according to the strategy that they had laid out some years earlier. But then in 89, you had a new president in South Africa, and that was F.W. de Klerk, who followed P.W. Botha. Botha was of a different generation and hardline and staunch supporter of apartheid, whereas de Klerk was more open to change. He did not set out and started his presidency with the call for abandoning apartheid, but he was more open to change and reforms. Most of all, he wanted the South Africans to rejoin the international community and lose the pariah status. With him came also a different composition of the South African cabinet, and that had also an effect on the Windvlei committee. That is the name of the committee that took the decisions. Starting 89, early 1990, when the new cabinet formed itself, there was room for maneuver, and steps towards signing the NPT were taken. But this didn't go very quickly because de Klerk and his advisors had to steer through a domestic political situation of unrest, and they feared a white backlash from the conservative white opposition party because at that time nobody wanted to give in to a black majority government. And Mandela was only released in February 1990. And the ANC officially unbanned around that time too, but they were mostly in exile and only slowly coming back to mainland South Africa. The whole political climate at that time was very unstable, and de Klerk and his cabinet, they didn't want to give up power to any other movement, be it white conservatives or the black majority government of the ANC. But eventually, and this is now unfolding against the transition in South Africa itself, they took the decision to sign the NPT, the decision to roll back the program. And this is very surprising to me. It was actually an easier and quicker decision. When de Klerk entered the presidential office, within 2 weeks, he called upon a meeting and tasked the participants to come up with plans how to best and safely dismantle the nuclear weapons that had been developed at that stage. 6 weapons in total, and a 7th was under construction. And it took a couple of months, and then they met again. And they said, yes, we need to do this. And then the program is dismantled. And in February 1990, this is within 4 or 5 months, he took the decision officially and tasked a dismantling committee to get rid of the nuclear weapons and return the enriched uranium safely to the Atomic Energy Corporation of South Africa. The public was not informed, of course, and neither were outside players like the IAEA or the US or the UK. This was all very closely hid from any public source. The bargaining process of joining the NPT was taking place in parallel. all under the assumption that South Africa had never had nuclear weapons. When you see, in hindsight, when you compare the decision to sign NPT and decision to roll back the program, the rollback decision was taken in secrecy and much quicker, whereas the NPT decision in favor of NPT was public, had a wider audience, and the Klerk had to skillfully steer that through a 2-year process, not losing to the political right in this country. The verification of South Africa's nuclear disarmament and the IAEA involvement, that is a very interesting story, because South Africa, after years, signed the NPT in July 1991. And then in September 1991, only after 2 years, although they had 18 months, they signed a comprehensive safeguard agreement with the agency and submitted the initial inventory declaration that had listed all the highly enriched uranium the South Africans possessed, not telling them the purpose of the highly enriched uranium, which was then recast and brought to the Atomic Energy Corporation, taken from the nuclear warheads that had been dismantled. The IAEA inspectors, when they arrived in November 91, although allowed to ask questions of the purpose of the enriched uranium, they never did so. And the head of the Atomic Energy Corporation in South Africa, Waldo Stumpf, he told me that the Klerk, the president, had told him, if they ask you, you can tell them the truth, but don't be proactive and tell them why we had a quarter ton of highly enriched uranium. And throughout almost 2 years of the IAEA verification mission in South Africa, the question was not asked by the IAEA staff, but pressure was mounting on the South African authorities to reveal the real purpose of the highly enriched uranium. Then on 24th of March 1993, President de Klerk in a press conference revealed that South Africa had developed at one point nuclear weapons, but also they dismantled them and then opened up to the IAEA. But what did this mean for the IAEA verification mission? It posed a huge problem for the IAEA inspectors because they had no capacity when it came to a former nuclear weapons program. They were invited by South Africa to assess and verify the amount of highly enriched uranium. Now they were tasked to look at the remnants of the defunct nuclear weapons program. The verification mission of the IAEA, 2 phases. One was until the announcement made by the Klerk, and the other one started then afterwards. And they invited nuclear weapons experts to join the IAEA mission. Together they verified that the South Africans had no more weapons, and also they now included into their visits facilities that had been working on the nuclear warheads that had earlier been not part of the inspections. There were 22 IAEA inspection missions to South Africa that included 150 visits of facilities, and that means an average 6 per month. Some scholars claim that it was almost a continuous presence of the IAEA in South Africa between 91 and 1993 when it ended. And South African authorities were very open, and this was praised by, for example, Hans Blix, the former IAEA Secretary General, and other people, that the South Africans were inviting the IAEA to visit any place at any time and ask questions that they wanted. This contributed to the overall successful mission. This helped not only South Africa to bolster its image as a non-proliferation poster child, as some scholars coined it, but also the IAEA, because remember at that time in the early 90s, there was the Iraq mission in which the IAEA did not discover facilities that could be used for the production of nuclear warheads. I heard this in interviews with former IAEA safeguards inspectors that they feared a similar scenario in the case of South Africa, that some things would not be disclosed and later on revealed to the world that the IAEA had not looked thoroughly enough.
The verification task was enormous due to the extensive fuel cycle that South Africa had. The years that fuel cycle had been operating, which is basically since 1970, and also then the unique design of some of the facilities which were never before safeguarded by the IAEA. Is the South African case study then of any value when considering future dismantling? There were many firsts for the IAEA in the South African case. First was their role. They had a difficult role. Their role is usually to confirm that peaceful nuclear programs are not illicitly put to military users. And now in the South African case, they were asked to verify for the very first time the elimination of a successful nuclear weapons program, which sprouted from expertise gained during a civilian nuclear program. This required a completely different skill set than what IAEA inspectors at that point had. The second first was also the agreement that had to be reached with South Africa as to what information would be shared and how, because South Africa was not obligated to reveal the former existence of a nuclear weapons program. They only had to reveal under the safeguards agreement with the IAEA that they had produced weapons-grade uranium. So this created a conundrum. There's weapons-grade uranium, but the IAEA could not quite go into the next step of asking, did you use it for weapons? Or did you have weapons?
Robin Möser and Anna-Mart van Wyk discuss the broader lessons about nuclear disarmament they have taken from studying the South African program.
I came up with 4 lessons, and that is the first, how the domestic political realm impacted on the Klerk's handling on the issue of the NPT. He was rather quick in giving the dismantling decision of the nukes, but the NPT accession was an issue that he was very hesitant about for domestic political purposes. The second point is how these South Africans over years tried to bargain something in return for their NPT accession with the IAEA, with the US, and very high-level meetings over years in Vienna, Washington, and Geneva. And they were very adamant in their stance that we need to get a quid pro quo for treaty accession. It didn't work this way because the overarching issue was apartheid. With apartheid still in place, the racial political system in South Africa, the states that South Africans approached could not do much. But when the South Africans changed their bargaining strategy in the late 1980s, early 90s, changing the focus from what do we get to let's make our NPT accession part of a regional approach, brokered by us, of course, that would also placate the domestic critics that South Africa signs the treaty for nothing in return. Another lesson could be that it was much harder for the Klerk to take the NPT decision compared to the disarmament decision. And lastly, it has to do with the working of sanctions and international isolation. In South Africa's case, they didn't help much to prevent them. Embargoes were in place and sanctions since early 70s or even late 60s, but still they developed nuclear weapons and could have developed even more if they didn't stop the problem before that. The infrastructure was in place and they acquired this despite international sanctions. By the early 1980s, the development of nuclear warheads really gained momentum. And of course, this was all accompanied by international criticism and sanctions. And you can only look to the US administrations during that time, except for the Carter administration. Nixon and Reagan, they were turning a blind eye, so to speak, on the South African ambiguity in the nuclear field. But when, for example, the depository powers were asked to do something in the field of sanction relief, when South Africa signed the NPT treaty, they could not do this because selective sanction relief was not possible for as long as the political system was apartheid. They said so many times that you can do a lot of things and sign the treaty, but according to the sanctions in place, apartheid is the thing on the table. And we cannot do much in terms of resumed nuclear cooperation and technology sharing as long as apartheid is not abolished. This tension is also apparent today with Iran and possibly North Korea, that you have regimes in power where the problem is also the regime and not just the question of development in the technical realm.
It also has a few difficulties for future cases. South Africa had a very small arsenal, and yet it took almost 20 years for full verification to be confirmed. The question is, can the South African case therefore even be compared in future cases of much larger arsenals? Granted, the initial secrecy from the South African side, as well as the destruction of thousands of technical documents, made the job of the weapons experts, in my view, much harder in South Africa. The other thing is that the circumstances in South Africa that led to the dismantling may not necessarily be replicable in other cases. Here I am specifically referring to a change in South Africa's regional and domestic situations. As I mentioned, an end to the border war with Angola and the pro-reform change in political leadership in 1989 in the country. This led to a complete regime change and full democracy in South Africa in 1994, and a government that was totally committed to non-proliferation taking over. And that is, of course, the ANC under Nelson Mandela. Sometimes I hear people say, but there were also regime changes in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. But the difference with those countries in disarmament, as examples versus South Africa, because often South Africa is mentioned in the same sentence as Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. But the difference is they had inherited nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. The verification took place as part of the dismantling process and the disarmament process in those countries. Where South Africa, again, did it in secrecy, so it was a post-facto verification that had to take place. Where does that bring us now? Despite South Africa declaring all of its weapons-grade highly enriched uranium and received an all-clear verification report from the IAEA, there are still some small proliferation concerns, as a large quantity of that HEU is still in storage at Pelindaba. But it gets inspected, it's under IAEA surveillance, and it also gets inspected regularly.
Thank you for listening, our guests for speaking, and the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding this series. Until next time, stay optimistic.